Okay. Great.
So, hello, and thank you so much for coming to speak with us.
We're delighted.
Hi. A pleasure to be here with you.
Wonderful. So, Sheila, we wanted to start in very general terms to ask you, as someone who's been reading Arendt and writing on Arendt for a long time, if you could give us, maybe by way of introduction, kind of a broad sense of your view why Arendt matters today in 2020. Why should we be turning to her, and perhaps how?
Mm. It's interesting. I had a discussion yesterday afternoon with some German colleagues at the Deutsches Historisches Museum, the German National Museum, as you know, that has mounted this huge Hannah Arendt exhibit. Unfortunately, because of the COVID situation, I have not been able to see it. And apparently this was the first event that they held. And of course, their angle, the discussion of yesterday evening was on Arendt and feminism. The woman question, Frauenfrage or Feminismus, they're not the same. But of course, the interesting issue is immediately the question came up, why is she still relevant? Why read her even on such subjects where her views were controversial as the question of feminism, the question of colonialism, and so on. My answer to that has always been, and something that you said at the beginning, that she's a thinker with whom one should think with her and against her, precisely because she's not a systematizer, a system builder, but someone who thinks her time. She is deeply, deeply connected to the tissue of the present and to thinking politically out of the questions of the present. Now, when I wrote my first Hannah Arendt book, The Reluctant Modernism of Hannah Arendt, 1992, 1996, and I said, I singled out three questions. One, I said, was the question of identity, about which she reflected through the Jewish problem. The third was the question of women, and the second was, and the third at the time, was her relevance and her appropriation by dissident movements like Solidarność and so on. And this was 1989, 1990. Today we are at a different moment, but in many ways, Arendt still is part of our conversation, or ought to be part of our conversation. To begin with the question of identity, for example, right? She distinguished, as between the pariah, the parvenu, and the self-conscious pariah. These were terms that she adopted from the French journalist Bernard Lazare. And the concept of pariah has a long history. And that Max Weber is, of course, the person who put it on the agenda in terms of social theory. But I find these differentiation between pariah, parvenu, and self-conscious pariah extremely interesting for all identity-based movements and their various inflections. They will not manifest themselves in the same way in a women's movement, nor will they manifest themselves, let's say, in, I don't want to call it just Black Lives, but there is a huge discussion, an important discussion today that is going on about the meaning of Blackness and also about the meaning of whiteness. But if you listen to some of the conversation with people, between people like Ta-Nehisi quotes a new generation and an older generation, maybe Cornel West, Angela, and others, these categories of pariah, parvenu, and self-conscious pariah are very significant. The one thing to point out is that these are categories, to some extent, from the standpoint of the observer, that then need to be inflected by the participants themselves. And Arendt referred to herself as a self-conscious pariah, that she accepted something about the otherness of Jewish identity in European culture, but did not just let that be defined by the others. Instead, she reappropriated what she considered to be valuable in that otherness. And you know, she's written extensively from everyone from Charlie Chaplin to Franz Kafka, and in fact, she made Charlie Chaplin an honorary Jew, as you know. So this is one area that still remains extremely relevant today. In terms of her political analyses, her reflections on authoritarianism are being cited almost every week, right? And it's a bit sad that the wheel has turned in such a way that she's gone from being the theorist of participatory democracy for Solidarność and East European liberation movements in 1989, and today we are confronted with a situation, if you want to call it authoritarianism, if you want to call it neo-fascism, if you want to call it the rise of new forms of tyranny and dictatorship. We all know that we are on the threshold of a kind of political wave across the world that is also threatening democracies, and none other than our own country at the present. So why would Arendt be relevant in this moment? Because I think she diagnosed something about authoritarian movements. I will not say totalitarian, because that's a more extreme condition. And when one reads her analysis in the third section of The Origins of Totalitarianism about the relationship of state, party, and movement, and the tendency of these movements to take away and to assume that the state apparatus belongs to them. Hence our discussion, is it appropriate for the president to address, to hold basically a speech in the White House? There's an election speech. The White House is the people's house, okay? This conflation of the office of the presidency with the personality that you see in Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, Orban, Bolsonaro. Arendt saw this. She also saw this, what she calls a kind of nihilistic alliance at times between the elites and the mob, that a kind of self-hatred on the part of the elites, who are themselves super intelligent, but who want to mobilize the mob, what we call, here sort of dog whistles in American colloquial terms. Take someone like, Steve Bannon. He's clearly a kind of intellectual of the right that is, again, mobilizing certain kinds of groups. And a third feature is, of course, the identification of the leader with the masses, the so-called authoritarian personality syndrome. These are not quite Arendt's own terms. They are the terms of course, the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer. But I think she was very much aware of this feature of mass psychology, that, the leader identifies with the people, and all the other institutions are thrown by or are obscured, sublimated, but bracketed to to the wayside. So these are just some of the features in which I think to think with Arendt still is extremely fruitful. And we can see the way in which her work has been used, for example, by the historian Timothy Snyder, my colleague from Yale, his book on tyranny, or Masha Gessen's extremely interesting reflections on authoritarianism, and also even loneliness under the COVID crisis. He's written a remarkable essay some months ago using Arendt's categories of isolation and loneliness, and the way some of the loneliness breeds authoritarian, or is susceptible to authoritarian projects. So,
wonderful. I want to ask as a follow-up, Seyla, because I find it really, really interesting. Another framework often invoked today in reflecting on our current political, and not just political, circumstances is the category of socialism. A lot of people find themselves, rereading Marx, for example, and referring to Marx. Would you care to say a little bit something about the way you see the relationship Arendt's thinking has vis-a-vis this, not just school of thought, but vis-a-vis this tradition? You mentioned the Frankfurt School, that could be one avenue.
Yes, I mean, Arendt has a very complex relationship to Marx and Marxism. And I think we underestimate the degree to which she was preoccupied with Marx. Clearly, in The Human Condition, if you remember that famous chapter on, I think it is even before labor work begins, she says, in these passages, Karl Marx will be criticized. And we know that a preliminary application to the Guggenheim Foundation, that preceded the Vita Activa, was called Karl Marx and the Tradition of Western Political Thought. I mean, more and more manuscripts are now coming out about that. She was preoccupied with Marx without always being the best interpreter of Marx. Let me put it that way. I think that the differentiation between work and labor, Werk und Arbeit, no? And as she says, this is a distinction that exists almost in all European languages. And it's interesting for Marx, particularly when you think about the 1844 manuscripts, what Marx is really talking about as Arbeit, labor, is much more like work. He's criticizing alienated industrial labor because the producer is alienated from the product, from the process, from relationships to other human beings. And from an Arendtian perspective, you would say, this is the kind of relationship that a writer would have to her writing. This is the relationship that an artist would have, to his product, or a musician. There is a work-like quality, which is a personal product of the individual involved, which you can't say about labor, mechanized labor, if you're there just, sort of putting midgets into various car things. So I think that Arendt really saw something there. But when it comes, to other aspects of Marxist theory, like historical materialism, I think she had a somewhat dogmatic, or maybe a reductionist, understanding of historical materialism as implying a kind of economistic theory of history. And she completely rejected that. And this rejection of, it gets very complicated. There is, of course, Walter Benjamin's critique of the sort of this teleological understanding of Marxist view of history, that somehow you know, as if the proletariat will inevitably march and we will attain. And, you know, the Walter Benjamin's critique here of the absurdity, or, you know, of this understanding of history, and instead, you know, he said he contrasts this to a much more messianic view, and much more a view of the process of the new, unexpected, interrupting. I mean, Arendt, who brought the manuscript of the philosophical theological manuscripts with her from Europe, Walter Benjamin's manuscript, it was in her bag after he committed suicide, very much accepted this critique of a certain understanding of the Marxian view of history. Now, the politics behind this is that both Walter Benjamin and Arendt's husband, Heinrich Blücher, were extremely critical of the kind of standard social democracy view, Kautsky and others. Blücher was part of the Spartacist party that believed much more in resistance, armed resistance, and they were allied with Rosa Luxemburg, and in fact he flees Germany after her death. Arendt is deeply aware of all these conversations, right? I mean, Scholem once referred to her as, you are coming from the German left. She said, no, I'm not. You know, I'm not. But on the other hand, she was so deeply aware, and also personally aware of this, that her husband was a deep critic of these tendencies within Marxism. So I think this left a lacuna in Arendt's work. It left a lacuna in the sense that, you know, despite her brilliance and her, I think, profound visions and understandings of politics at the theoretical level, there is no place for the economy in her analysis. I say at the theoretical level because when you read her as a historian of the two revolutions, her reflections on anti-Semitism, her reflections on the rise of imperialism, and the endless manuscripts that are now coming out on the Jewish question, of course the economy is there. It is there everywhere, right? And in fact, this is one aspect of her analysis of the Jewish question, her pointing out to the Hofjuden, the court Jews, their positions in helping the, the regimes, the royalty, etc. This is one aspect of her analysis that got others so pissed off that, you know, they said she's like a self-hating Jew. Is it because the Jews were, you know, part of these money houses, lending houses, etc., that they were also hated? So at the meta level, though, of her analysis, somehow the economy falls by the wayside. And sometimes she doesn't distinguish clearly between the social and the economic, which is always a headache for the students, because when the section in the human condition called The Rise of the Social is really about the rise of the economy, and it is about the modern market society. And she knows what this is, but so students go, what is this? What is being talked about here? So I don't think that, you know, one can appropriate the term socialism for any kind of Arendtian thing of the future. In fact, her main point would be that you have to think the form of the political as such, and but where there could be a meeting point is in her concept of power, which I have called in various writings an associative versus an instrumental concept of power. The associative power concept implies a kind of generativity, self-generativity, and you might say it's compatible with a vision of a kind of society of respect and solidarity and, you know, certainly equality. So, you know, but what you have to say that because of her fear of Marxist reductionism, and because her fear that this kind of understanding of history would lead to a terrible politics, okay, to subservience to the will of the party, to the authority of the party, and that is Luxemburg's critique of Lenin, she just somehow rejects this, this political ideal. But again, the conversation with Karl Marx is a rather complex and tangled one, and you know, deserves much more attention than we've paid it in the secondary literature. There's almost hardly any kind of, I don't know of any single one monograph on Marx and Arendt or something like that.
Maybe this is the monograph Courtney will write. So Courtney, you take on.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a fair bit of work, or started some work on Arendt's writings on Marx that we can get into later. But one thing that I actually did want to ask about that your last statement brought up, as you were talking about the interplay between the political, the social, and the economic, and Arendt's desire to disentangle the two, I was reminded of the moment in your book, in the chapter on migration, where you talk about the difficulty today of differentiating between what are often called economic migrants versus political asylum seekers, and, you know, the problem of, in an interconnected world in which markets are political decisions that then have economic ramifications that can lead to material deprivation, and, you know, in which all of these things, not to mention with climate now, are so entangled. What do you think Arendt has to tell us about questions of migration in today's moment?
The first answer is not much. The second answer is, you know, there's no one in contemporary thought that at the time that she wrote reflected so deeply on the refugee condition. I mean, the phrase, the right to have rights, just keeps reverberating at so many levels, because it is the right of, what is it exactly? Is it the right to belong? Is it the right to citizenship? Is it the right to having a place in the world? And is that the task of politics? And I think it's an extremely rich concept. I think I've only written about it 4 times. I think I have to stop right now at some point. But believe it or not, there is some literature right now that is calling itself the right not to have rights, which is quite puzzling. But if we just go back for a second to the right to have rights before we talk about the migration economic political issue in particular. I mean, Arendt is not a liberal rights theorist. This is not at all where she's coming from. And what made her reflect about the right to have rights was her utter and total perplexity about the condition of being a refugee, 1, being stateless, 2. And there is a distinction between being a refugee and being stateless. And Arendt sometimes is not quite correct, particularly from the standpoint of international law. not all refugees were stateless. Even, I mean, the German Jews were rendered stateless because they were denaturalized, okay? But a lot of Russian emigres were not. The German socialists were not. So this is a distinction that needs to be made first. But the point of the matter is that the refugee became sort of the paradigm example of one for whom no public political authority would speak or would stand up. So what Arendt portrayed there so poignantly, okay, is this condition, which is not just a legal and a political condition, but I say it's also her description phenomenologically about the loss of a place in the world, right? And her marvelous essay, We Refugees, right? And this notion of a loss of a place in the world, of course, can apply to those who are not just refugees, but refugees literally, in that sense, do not have that place into which, you know, they were born, or they belong, the place to which they belong. So there is such wealth in those passages, and you can treat them at so many levels. And in the chapter that you're using, I talked about the justification problem, the philosophical justification problem. So she says, okay, you cannot ground the right to have rights on nature, you cannot ground it on history. So then what are we left with? We are left with this concept that we are not born equal, we are equal because we together establish a political community in which we consider each other as equals. Now, is this then a decisionist point of view? And there come all those who love pushing Arendt in the company of, you know, Carl Schmitt. That's another issue. But, and I make the argument, look, Arendt is a anti-foundationalist thinker, avant la lettre, but basically what, you know, she's pointing to is the openness and the emergence of freedom, okay? And that in effect, freedom and equality, building a world together, are projects that go together. And there is no sort of philosophical grounding in a Cartesian sense that you can give to how this project is going to be or ought to be realized. So what does this have to do with the problems of migration? Well, the dilemma of the right to have rights is at a conceptual level that in a world which is territorialized by nation states, in a world where every piece of the earth is a territory, okay? So the minute you cross a border, you are in somebody else's jurisdiction and territory. Although freedom of movement is recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a fundamental right, the question is, there is an asymmetry between emigration and immigration. Emigration, leaving one's country, is a fundamental human right, but immigration requires the sovereign into whose territory you enter to accept you, and also in some ways. So hence, migration also is involved with the right to have rights, in the sense that if there are universal human rights, let's say the right to movement, to leave one's country, which all the post-war declarations accept, then what happens to the asymmetry? You know, what happens to sovereign authority or sovereign territoriality at the other end? So does the right to have rights then imply a kind of super let me put it, supranation state legal order, right? And this has been the sort of, for me, for my own work in the last 20 years, the kind of the dilemmata that Arendt's work opposes between this increasingly universalist cosmopolitan entitlement to rights and the continuing territorialization of sovereignty and all the problems. So migration is a very good example in that respect. And so what we have now is, of course, because we have the 1951 Refugee Convention and its protocol, at least about 141 states of the world have signed up to the Refugee Convention, and they declare themselves obliged not to refoule, not to return a refugee who claims being persecuted or has fear of persecution back to their home country. Okay, and yet at the same time, the category of economic refugee doesn't really exist. I mean, there is now a lot of push both from activists, legal theorists, and others saying, "Come on, how can you separate out economic persecution from political persecution so clearly?" I mean, some people are not given economic opportunity because of their ethnicity, because of their nationality, etc. So you see, I mean, the law is always based on certain fictions, and I don't mean fictions in the sense of lies or falsehoods, I mean idealizations. And so there is a paradigmatic refugee behind the convention, and that refugee, of course, does not fit in to our current reality. Now, one issue, and Amir knows quite about this, is of course why so-called Palestinian refugees, okay? So the refugee status of an entire group, and within the United Nations framework, their needs are also administered by a different administration. I mean, they don't come under the general UNHCR framework. But then there is also a refugee condition when you are denied from returning, to the territory from which you came. Let's leave aside the theological discussion, just simply the territory from which you came before you were rendered a refugee, right? And then, of course, the question of de facto statelessness, right? Palestinian statelessness, either you get a passer-aller from Israeli authorities or from the United Nations or whatever. So there are also refugees created in these conditions of unsettled territorial conflict, right? And that is in some ways, it used to be quite a unique phenomenon, but now with the Rohingya and so many refugees at the end, 2 decades ago, of the Yugoslav war, it's becoming more and more common. And of course, conditions of the refugees in Africa at the time of the Rwandan massacre. So I've strayed a bit off your question, because what I'm trying to say is that her reflections and this phrase opens up so many different dimensions for thinking about the question whether you want to do it phenomenologically, whether you want to do it in terms of international law, whether you want to do it in terms of migration studies. There just is a lot there.
Listening to you, I'm thinking, specifically about the question of visa as an institution. And I'm curious about your view in this regard. So when we're talking about the right to have rights, for example, would you include the right to acquire visa in this context? Or is it a matter of national sovereignty?
Well, a visa is basically a permission that another country is giving you to visit its territory. So a visa is part of the it's part of the gesture of hospitality, right? And so this raises the whole question about hospitality, you know, what. And as you know, again, I've written about this in the context of Kant, and the right to hospitality, as you know, Kant called the only cosmopolitan right, that if your intentions are peaceful, and the right to have access or to visit another, if your intentions are peaceful, that was for him Besuchsrecht, no, the right to visitation, was a fundamental human right, because in some ways the earth, you know, the earth belonged to us all, although he didn't use, you know, this at the time Christian terminology of belonging, you know, to us all, but for him it was a kind of aspect of human freedom that we would seek each other out. And as he puts it, since the earth is an Erdkugel round, we can't keep going around without bumping into others. So sooner or later we will bump into someone else, you know. But the right of hospitality is extremely important, because if another country denies you a visa, okay, this is not just a sovereign privilege, although your countries act like. There has to be some very justifiable reasons for why you are denied a visa. National security, health considerations, but matters of ethnicity, religion, race, these would be against international human rights agreements and covenants to deny you a visa on those grounds. But many states still do it. I mean, it's just that we know that within the European Union Schengen area, the borders have been eliminated, and Norway and Switzerland are also a part of that, although they're not part of the European Union. When the borders are eliminated, you don't have the visa requirement, right? But take, for example, the very intense visa discussion between Turkey and the European Union. I mean, Turkish citizens are the largest resident group of third country nationals in the European Union, right? And so why are there still visa regulations? Well, because they're not part of the Schengen Agreement. They haven't been invited to join the European Union. But this kind of sovereigntist gesture is a kind of a violation also of a kind of reciprocity on which international relations always rest, right? I mean, from a legal point of view, we are entering a very murky domain, which is like, okay, you know, they're saying, no, there can be definite, you know, human rights violations. For example, family unification. Okay, you can't just say, you know, if you're France or Germany, okay, we've had enough Turks, I'm fed up with this, you know, we don't want any more. Okay, so you have a child at home who wants to come, or you have an older person who wants to come. What do you say as a state? This is my sole prerogative? No. they want to say that, and very often they get away with it. But if there is any kind of concern about non-violation of human rights, respecting of human rights, then they'll say, oh, well, the child can come if he or she is under 14 or is under 16, so that they can be acculturated and so on. So to tell you the truth, I mean, I don't quite know, besides, you know, Kant's reflections on the right of hospitality as a universal right, it is so difficult to reflect theoretically about these issues from the perspective of a system of territorially established sovereign states. You just get into the weeds, and then philosophically, I think it's very difficult to get out of the weeds. I mean, I don't know any significant theoretical work on visas. Do you? Maybe there is some. Well, there's a good book on passport.
I must admit that, you know, one of the students who will be a part of the seminar is working on this question at the moment. So I'm reading her work, and as I'm reading her work, I'm thinking about Arendt's work and your work. So in the context of this, I was very curious to hear your view on the matter.
Fascinating, interesting. I mean, I'm not remembering the name of the colleague who is a social theorist who wrote the book about the history of the passport. He teaches, you know, social theory at CUNY. But there are analyses, historical analysis about the emergence of borders and territorialization and passports, which are extremely helpful in that respect. But again, you know, the visa. Yeah.
Sheila, also with an eye kind of on the clock, and you've been, you know, incredibly, you know, gracious with your time. One last question, perhaps. You know, one of the terms I find especially fascinating in Arendt's work and rereading her work is the notion of foundation. As you reflect on our current condition in this country, but not only in this country, around the world, the kind of challenges we are facing with the rise of authoritarianism, you know, from China to Brazil and beyond, the challenge of climate change and global warming, however you want to call it. Do you think we can address those challenges by way of political action and reform, kind of lowercase political question, you know, reform or action? Or do you think this is a moment of foundation, or should we aspire to a moment of foundation?
Honestly, I'm a little puzzled by the juxtaposition because in Arendtian terms, political action can lead to foundations. I mean, if we mean by foundations, and founding has this ambivalent term, right? Founding means establishing, it means generating, it means originating. And in German as well, begründen, yeah? Gründung is also the foundation of a building, of an institution. Arendt very often thought about politics in topographical terms. Once I sort of accused her of phenomenological essentialism, saying each thing has its place in Arendt, you know, work is here, labor is here, action is here. But this topographical thinking, is that she's always thinking about the city. She's always thinking about the founding of the city, and not so much about or she thinks about the walls as law, you know, in her. And so freedom for her at its best is that moment of founding of the new, right? And that's why she talks in her book on revolution about Nova Ordo Secularum, a new age, the founding of a new age. And there's some beautiful passages on this at the end of volume 2, The Life of the Mind Unwilling, where she explicates the relationship between freedom and founding. And what she has in mind there is the possibility of new beginnings that will remain in time and establish new modes of acting, new practices, and new institutions, right? There's always a little bit of a tension in Arendt because in many ways she seems to be a movement thinker and not so much a kind of institutional thinker. But when you keep in mind this kind of topographical aspect of her work, also, of course, her fundamental concept, the public space, the public sphere, the public square, right? You can see that she does relate movement and foundation. This would be an Arendtian moment also in the sense of maybe radical rethinking or thinking on a geländer without banisters, that is to think new. Certainly, I mean, the climate change, or what used to be called the ecological crisis, right? This would require a kind of new thinking of our whole metabolismic relationship with nature, you know, and how to conceptualize this is very challenging. And you know, there is some work that has been already done in the late 60s, 70s. The great philosopher of ecology, Mary Bookchin, for example, that is, you know, so what do we call it exactly? But in calling it climate change, are we also reflecting about our place in nature, and how do we do that? One interesting aspect, or one interesting respect in which Arendt may be somewhat helpful for us, is her distinction between the earth and the world, again, in the human condition. The world is what we sort of retrieve from the earth, and the space that we create within the world. It is the human space within which the buildings, the artifacts, the art, the music, the institutions, the practices, that's the world is the space of human appearances and the space of objects and so on. But there is a tension, she said, in the modern world, particularly with the kind of scientific process of production, plus also, and here her reflections on nuclear weapons, right? And the way in which this process may impact the conditions on Earth, right? And may make the Earth itself unlivable for human beings. Again, not to forget, and I hadn't paid that much attention to these passages myself for years, but you know, reading is always rereading and new reading, as we know. If you look at the opening passages of the human condition, that to us it seems so quaint. It begins with the man landing on the moon, right? But what she is concerned about there is that we are going to leave the earth as the natural habitat of humanity, right? And that loss of the natural habitat for her will also result in this concomitant concept of, you know, this of worldliness. So there is a lot that we can do there, you know, thinking anew, thinking towards new foundations, you know, maybe it isn't just, fiddling around with carbon emissions and, this, that, but it requires a deeper thinking. And of course, some of Heidegger's later work also was beginning to do that. The problem of technology. I guess the dilemma has always been that when you start going into these kind of, when you give primacy to the problem of technology and the earth, it's as if the question of politics disappears. And some of this may be very compatible with a kind of, how shall I put it, charismatic eschatological politics. Yeah, I mean, that's why, if you want, maybe some of the left thinkers have stayed away from what are called like deep ecology movements. That like, okay, so what is the politics of the, do we follow the leader? But, so maybe the earth and the world, if we take these as, in dialectical tension, and realizing that, I mean, unless we act, what else is there? Was gibt's noch? I start speaking German sometimes. You see, in your class, I can do it. In many of my classes, no one understands anything anymore. So at least when I get impatient, it's just like, so what else? What else?
This is a wonderful note. Both to reflect on what you've said and also to thank you so much and so warmly for everything you said. We conclude
my pleasure.
New thinking and new beginnings.
Yeah, I enjoyed the conversation. It's good to think. It's good also to think together. That is also a process. So I wish you and the students wonderful, wonderful semester. Drop me a note about what's going on, what they're doing, and enjoy. It sounds like a great class. I will teach Arendt again, but in the spring I'm going to teach a seminar at Yale. I'm going to look at this new literature on capitalism. Just like there is just so much right now.
Yeah.
Out of the Frankfurt School, Rahel Yegi, and of course, my good friend Nancy Fraser has always been working on this, Albeda Asmanova, and just so much new writing about the crisis of capitalism. So I feel as if like, okay, I thought that, we can't ever forget this. So it's back to the basics. Let's see what there is out there.
Yeah. We're living this conundrum, literally, every hour of the day.
That we are.
Yeah.
I know. Okay.
So again, warmest thanks, and we will not only drop you a note, we will also share with you some of the work the students do on our platform. We have this virtual, public space that we created, and we will share with you some of their work.
Terrific. I much appreciate it. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye. All the best.